Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this sunshiny Friday morning. At least it is sunshiny here in Ohio. We're happy to have you all with us. I know that this is not a typical webinar hour for us, but we felt that this was a topic just too important to put off. And so we're really glad that we have a couple of wonderful speakers with us today. You might remember several months ago with the initial adult Pfizer vaccination approval that we had Dr. Tim Franson and Dr. Tim Cripe on to talk through COVID vaccination and implications and things to know. And we are thrilled to have them both back with us again today in light of the recent approval for vaccination for 5 to 11-year-olds, which is just so incredibly exciting. And so I think without further ado, we'll go ahead and just dig in. We're going to start off with Dr. Tim Franson. I'll let him introduce himself and go through some initial slides, and then we will pivot to Dr. Tim Cripe, who can go through some specific data points with us. So Dr. Franson, I'll go ahead and let you jump right in.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and welcome all. Thank you for the opportunity to share in discussion about this very important topic. My name is Tim Franson. I'm an adult infectious disease physician, but primarily work in the drug regulatory area and have the pleasure of working with PPMD for over a dozen years now. Today's discussion will revisit some of the things that perhaps several of you had heard in our last webinar when there was the initial emergency authorization for COVID vaccine. And I think that we will have some interesting new information to share. My responsibility here is to talk about some of the process and how these approvals and authorizations, which are different, do come into being, what that means for patients, and how we can move ahead together to understand the benefits and risks of any of these steps amidst this pandemic situation. So without further ado, the next slide, please. Just thinking about how one looks at benefits and risks, which is exactly what you and I and everyone else does when we make any considerations. What are the pros and cons of these particular situations? And I'll be talking about the regulatory aspects. Dr. Cripe will be talking about some very particular elements relative to this vaccine authorization for the new pediatric age population. But FDA, physicians, nurses, pharmacists, and patients all have perhaps a very different perspective on benefits and risks. FDA looks at these kind of questions from a population basis, and that's what we'll be discussing when we look at how FDA makes its decision on whether to authorize, which is kind of halfway there, or fully approve, which is all the way to acceptance of vaccine use in this case. Certainly when your physician sits down with you, or your pharmacist or nurse practitioner and so forth, to talk about benefits and risks, it's interpreting what happens in a population within the context of any individual patient. So what specific features might your child or your family have that would dictate some different considerations, perhaps being on other medicines or having concurrent diseases? So it would be important to make that assessment, and then every patient has to take in that information and decide what is that acceptable benefit versus risk ratio. Today, I'll be talking primarily about how FDA thinks about that, but I want to reassure you that the foundations of this process result from data, and that without studies, no actions take place. It requires good medicine, good science, and very good study design, and all that is incorporated into both the authorization and approval process. And no product will be approved for marketing in the United States unless it is shown to have, the governmental term is substantial evidence, but that means that it has proven quality, safety, and effectiveness beyond a shadow of a doubt. It does not mean perfect, but it means the totality of evidence is very weighty in terms of the benefits, far exceeding the risks. So if I could have the next slide, please. What we'll talk about is the process for vaccine development, which is similar to drug development overall. But first, the vaccine is developed. In historical situations, even very recently, it would often take 4, 5, 6 years or more to develop a new vaccine. I have to say that this recent experience during COVID has been nothing short of remarkable. And it's primarily due to the excellent collaboration between practitioners, government, industry, and an agreement to take a very proactive, aggressive stance, as I'll show you in a moment, to compress the timelines for this, because the need was, of course, urgent. So once a vaccine is developed and tested in preclinical, that would mean studies prior to humans in test tubes, or sometimes with animal studies. One then has clinical trials conducted to look at the benefit and risk in individuals receiving the vaccine. As you're aware, that occurred initially in adults, and then further information in adolescents, and now sufficient information to make decisions in the age 5 through 11 group. When a company does that research and compiles it for a review, then it is provided to FDA in a submission for their review. They then bring these type deliberations frequently to what's called an advisory committee. That's a national panel of experts who look at the information in the same way FDA would look at it and help with an opinion as to whether the burden of proof is in favor of authorization or approval. And that is the FDA's decision, again, weighted on benefit and risk criteria. And I'll come to in a second the emergency authorization and how that comes to be and why it is different than approval. Once FDA makes that decision, and before the new vaccine can be provided to the public, the Centers for Disease Control, and specifically their advisory committee on immunization practices, so the overall vaccine experts, the ones you have certainly heard about talking about, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, or other vaccines that are usually required by most states for school-age children. They will make a determination as well, not only on reasserting FDA's review, but also looking at reasonable distribution pathways and agreeing on where to focus vaccine distribution. And that then triggers vaccine access. Who gets it? Where will it be provided? When might you have access? And how much other information you might require? And if a vaccine has received emergency use authorization, which is EUA on the slides, what else do they need to provide to the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, to get full approval? So if I could have the next slide, let's just distinguish what emergency use authorization is. And that is a specific authority which is granted to FDA under conditions of pandemic or what they call all hazards preparedness. So in order to have an emergency use authorization, you need to have an emergency. And the emergency, of course, in this case, is our COVID epidemic. The emergency use authorization is temporary. When the emergency expires, EUAs also expire. And so these studies need to proceed to be able to get full approval. And that requires additional review by FDA. So for the next slide, just to briefly go through the sequence so you understand how that emergency use is provided, I've got a little color wheel for you. And if I could have that, thank you. As you'll see, if you start in the lower left corner for item 1, first you have to confirm a public health emergency. And you or I can't do that, but the White House and HHS, Health and Human Services Administration, is able to do that. And once that emergency is declared, then companies may proceed with abbreviated tests to be able to provide a submission of information based on trials they have done with the vaccine, with recipients, first in adult and then again in pediatric populations. And when there's sufficient observation after the vaccines so that we have a good idea of safety, and the minimum in the adults was at about 2 months minimum. We have quite a substantial additional duration of observation after vaccines, including for most of the younger aged population as well now. But that information is then submitted to the FDA to see A, if it works, and B, if it's safe. And then, of course, there is another tier of assessment, which is the quality of the vaccine components. The FDA will inspect facilities and look at information related to the safety, purity, potency of those compounds. And then as you get to step 5, FDA then makes a decision about whether to approve or reject the emergency use authorization submission. And then step 6 occurs if the emergency terminates and there is no more EUA. But I want to reassure you that all the companies that have EUAs at this point for COVID vaccines are also diligently working on full approvals. In fact, the reason that you may be interested in what we're talking about today is that a full approval for the Pfizer BioNTech COVID vaccine was achieved for adults just recently, within about the last month or so. So with the next slide, now that I've completely bored you about EUAs, just to compare and contrast, on the left side, you see FDA emergency use authorization, which is based on some reasonably sized, but not typically sized vaccine approval submissions. That is one of the key differences here, that usually larger and longer trials and observation periods, respectively, are required for full FDA approval. And that is indeed what's happening with those which have started as emergency use. The other key thing which allowed the ability to expedite how rapidly we could get access to new vaccines under emergency use related to at-risk production. That is, without knowing whether all the vaccines would make it to the finish line at the same time, the government subsidized the production of these new vaccines to allow them to be ready to go at the time an emergency use authorization occurred. In typical FDA approval processes, full approval, as you see on the right hand, usually production would not occur until later in the testing process, or even at the time of approval reviews and decisions. So that makes a huge difference in how rapidly we can get things. And it is not done with a compromise on the amount of safety observation required. So if I could have the next slide, please. So here are the vaccines that at least are currently under consideration in the US. And as you see, the Pfizer messenger RNA vaccine, which Dr. Cripe discussed at some extent at the last webinar and quite excellently laid out the scientific background for that, has already been full approved as of August 2021, after it had its emergency use authorization. I believe that began in December 2020. So we've had considerable opportunity to observe the post-vaccine safety in those groups, and also this emergency use authorization now in children for age 5 through 11. There was, lest you be concerned, studies in age 12 through 16 as well with the Pfizer vaccine. And that has also achieved EUA, but not full approval yet. And of course, the age 5 through 11 group that we're talking about now is because of the decision just last week by FDA and then CDC to provide emergency access. In contrast, the other vaccines are a step behind, if you will. The Moderna vaccine, which is based on the same scientific platform as Pfizer BioNTech's vaccine, is authorized under emergency use for the adult age groups Studies are pending and actually have been submitted to FDA and undergoing review. And the Janssen or J&J vaccine also has emergency use authorization for adults, pending for children. In addition, there are other vaccines in development. I mentioned two that are a little further along than others, but there are quite a number. I believe there were 26 at last listing, which are undergoing study. So there is and should be no concern about vaccine access, at least in the United States. If I could have the next slide, please, then. So there are resources that you can go to talk about vaccine eligibility overall. And there is an interactive website that I have listed at the top of this slide that you can look at to see who is first in the queue as new approvals come forward or authorizations. But that is just for reference for family purposes as well. The thing I'm sure you're probably wondering is, well, how safe is it for children with special needs? And there are some data in transplant populations and those who are on immunosuppressive drugs that indicate reasonable vaccine response there. And that probably translates into assuming reasonable response as well in the population we're talking about now for Duchenne patients. I'm not aware of any specific studies in Duchenne only young men for the vaccine efficacy and safety, but we should have every degree of comfort and assurance that what we're seeing in the other populations on the basis of these studies predicts a very strong benefit and no untoward or unexpected risks, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the next slide, please, is just going through the near-term efficacy appears to be very good in 90+% of those recipients, and that safety, there is, I believe, 2 months on the age 5 through 11, and those older, probably over a year in data now for a number of those patients. Obviously, this is very new to all of us, and so unknowns remain, and unknowns are always frustrating to us, both in medicine and being as parents or grandparents. So how long these last and whether booster doses will be needed are unclear at this point, but have already been authorized under emergency use for those in the highest risk groups, like the elderly, like me. And so I've had my booster. And also the observation of any unanticipated side effects, which we will be talking about. I know a lot of you have read in the media about myocarditis or heart inflammation that may be associated with vaccines. Of interest, to put things in perspective, if you look at the Center for Disease Control's website and other scientifically reliable resources, the information suggests that one is more likely to get myocarditis from actual infection with COVID-19 than you would to get myocarditis from the vaccine. So again, another benefit risk calculation that we must be very attentive to. And finally, and this is a broader concern, if vaccine hesitancy impacts the target herd immunity that we hope to achieve for the US and the global population. The World Health Organization projects that 70 to 80% of the world's population would need to be vaccinated in order to achieve significant herd immunity. That just means that the transmission rates are likely to then fall precipitously once you get to very low transmission rates. So in handing off to Dr. Cripe, I'll present one last slide, which is while we're talking about the vaccine, and that's certainly very important, and we are anticipating more approvals for the additional Moderna, Janssen, and other vaccines. Let's not forget that there are a number of things we can do in addition to promote overall community and personal health. So best advice and best practices are continuing our appropriate hand washing, especially when out in public, Social distancing is still quite reasonable, as are masks. And I know you see a lot of information pro and con on masks. I like to think of them and advise family and patients as well to think of it similar to seat belts. They're not perfect, but they sure work. They sure help. And it makes a lot of sense to use appropriate precautionary measures when you're in crowded, inside, indoor circumstances. Next, review your vaccine eligibility for your family members to look at the pros and cons. And then watch for, anticipate new information and possible modifications in the recommendations for how often one gets the precautionary measures updated or vaccines. And this is good because it indicates we're continually learning about things that none of us ever even spoke about 2 years ago. So I think overall we should have considerable optimism and should have ongoing attentiveness to new information. And without further ado, let me pass the microphone, if you will, to my colleague, Dr. Tim Cripe, who can provide firsthand insight and information on care.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. What prompted this webinar was the recent approval, the emergency use authorization, as you said, for children 5 to 11 of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. So we wanted to review those data. I'm Tim Cripe, as he said. I'm chief of the Division of Hematology, Oncology, Blood and Marrow Transplant, Nationwide Children's Hospital. I have a PhD in genetics, do molecular biology research, including with viruses, and we wanted to review some of the issues at hand. So I've started out here with some not so fun COVID-19 facts, and that is, what are the numbers in children? So COVID-19 was among the top 10 leading causes of death in children ages 5 to 14 in January to May this year. So there had been some media reports early on in the pandemic that children were not susceptible to serious side effects from infection, and yes, a lower rate than adults, but not true that they're not susceptible. So really it is a significant problem. There was a 419% increase in cases less than 18 years old during August and September this year compared to June and July. And that was due to the Delta variant that popped up and spread like mad. So I think the lesson here is that because even though there's vaccinations out there and people getting COVID, this virus finds you. It finds you wherever you are. And the chances of everybody getting it, if you're not vaccinated, is high. So I think you assume if you don't get vaccinated, you are going to get COVID. Since it's taking so long to reach that herd immunity. So far during the pandemic, for patients or kids age 5 to just under 12, there have been 1.8 million cases, 8,622 hospitalizations, and 143 deaths. So not a benign problem. There have also been 2,600 cases of this crazy disorder called multi-system inflammatory syndrome that happens in kids and adolescents where they have to go to the intensive care unit and they get a lot of problems and have to go on ventilators and so forth. So, and those numbers are higher now. Those data are through October 14th of this year. So it's a significant problem. And that's why the big push to get vaccines into children. And it's not surprising that vaccinations should be done in children. We do tons of vaccines in children already. And that's what protects us all from polio and measles and mumps and rubella and all the other nasty diseases that we have vaccinations for. So if we go to the next slide, then this shows you the cases, a graph of the cases. You know, we had in the summer months, you can see partly to the right of the graph, sort of May, June from this year, it looked like things have been dropping and then they surged again. The light green is for 0 to 4 years of age. The dark blue is 5 to 11, and the other color is 12 to 15. So clearly this parallels the adult cases and is a significant ongoing pandemic among children. In fact, they're probably, because so many adults have been vaccinated now, they're probably the main reservoir of this virus and the spread of it and the cause of the persistence of the pandemic. So the faster we can get children vaccinated, the sooner we'll get done with this pandemic. So if you can go to the next slide. So the Pfizer trial that we are here to discuss is a 10 microgram dose of the RNA as opposed to the 30 microgram dose in adults. So it's 1/3 the dose. It was selected from an initial phase 1 study where they tested a variety of different doses and found that this dose gives enough protection that it's still worthwhile and yet has fewer side effects. And so the thinking was in the children who are younger, they won't need as high a dose as the adults. And so we can get away with a little bit lower dose, maybe reduce the numbers of side effects and still get good efficacy. Like the adults, there are 2 doses given 3 weeks apart. And in the trial, there were 1,500 vaccine recipients, and then they did another expansion of 2,200. So just to put this into perspective, when you do gene therapy trials for Duchenne, they're in the tens to hundreds, okay? When you do trials for SMA, they're in the tens, and approvals have been based on, 100 or so patients. So we're talking 1,500 vaccine recipients, total actually of 3,700. So even though these numbers are much smaller than what the vaccine has been tested for in the adult population, this is a significant number of people that we have experience with for this vaccine. So they found similar levels of antibodies as those found in young adults who got the higher dose. And the side effects were more mild and moderate. We'll look at those in a minute, and occurred within 1 to 2 days and usually resolved shortly thereafter. Mainly injection site pain, fatigue, headache, muscle aches, and chills. Now, in terms of the myocarditis, which is obviously a big issue for the Duchenne population, through 3 months of observation, they didn't find any in these younger patients. And as far as we know, and just to answer one of the questions in the chat, I don't know that any Duchenne patients were in the trial. I suspect not, but I don't know that for a fact. But the point is they didn't see any, but it's still early. And this is only after 3 months of observation. So it's really too short a follow-up to know what the incidence of the myocarditis is in this younger population. But we do know, and we'll see in a minute, that it's most common in the adolescents and young adults, and less common in the older patients. So it may very well be less common in the younger ones as well. We do expect that the myocarditis or pericarditis incidence will be less than in those populations because of the lower dose. So that's one positive. But we need a longer follow-up, and that's why it's at this point only an emergency use authorization. So we'll get the full approval later on when there's longer follow-up. Okay, so next slide shows you a little bit of the data. This is the side effects, and they're graded as mild, moderate, severe, or grade 4, which is more than severe, requiring hospitalization. And you can see that there were no severe or grade 4. There's no gray or red boxes here. So they're all mild or moderate, the green or blue. And this is after the first dose and after the second dose. And this slide is just about the local reactions. So redness, swelling, and pain at the injection site. So if you look, they compare the 10 microgram dose in the young patients, 5 to 12, compared to placebo in those same patients. And then also they show you the 30 micrograms that was given to the adolescents. And you can see that there is some redness and swelling a little bit in the placebo group, but certainly more, about 3 times more in the children who got the 10 microgram dose. And those rates for redness and swelling do happen to be a little bit higher than in the adolescents for reasons we don't understand. In terms of actual pain at the injection site shown on the right side of the slide, you can see that actually just injecting the needle and the fluid causes pain in 30% of patients. That's the placebo. And then about 70 to 75% of patients had some pain, either mild or moderate, at the injection site in the kids. Not unexpected and not inconsistent with other vaccinations. That number is slightly lower than in the adolescents at the higher dose, but not too significantly different. And the numbers between the first and second dose are about the same. you react in the first dose, you're probably going to react in the second dose. That's the bottom part of the slide. On the next slide, you'll see the systemic effects. So that was the local effects. This is a systemic effects. So same scoring, same color scheme. Again, no real gray or red boxes. So all things were mild or moderate. They looked at fever, fatigue, headache, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle pain, and joint pain. Now here you do see, and this is within 7 days period after getting the vaccine. You can see the vaccine at the top and the placebo along the bottom for comparison. And here you do see a lower incidence in general of these effects than in the adolescents who got the higher dose. For example, so fever, 2.5% of children got fever and 7% of the adolescents with the higher dose got fever. Fatigue, about half of those who, the rate was half of that of the adolescents, so 32% got fatigue and 60% in the adolescents. Headache, similar numbers. Chills, lower overall, but more in the adolescents. Vomiting, hardly anybody got them. And diarrhea, similar, lower in the children than in the adolescents. Muscle pain, lower in this now than this is more systemic, not site injection pain. This is more muscle aches, and then joint pain. So in almost every category, except the vomiting, which were very low for both, the children had fewer side effects as predicted, likely due to the lower dose. And some of those, as you can see in the placebo, happened as well, fatigue, headache. So just going through a shot causes some of these, but certainly the increase over placebo is due to the vaccine itself. So, and there's a comment that because most of the Duchenne patients are on steroids, they were probably excluded from the trial, but that doesn't mean that you can't get the vaccine once it's now approved. They didn't want any complications of the results for people that were on steroids. And we don't know really the effect of steroids, but most vaccinations do work even when you're on steroids. So it's not a contraindication to get it, although it was a contraindication to be in the trial. The next slide, please. So how did it work? This shows a graph where the axis on the left, the y-axis shows you the incidence of COVID-19 infections. And this is a percent, or this is an incidence. So 0.01 would be 1%. So it's a very low incidence, but each of these tick boxes is adding another case. These are cumulative incidents. So you can see up 1, then up to 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6. So the red line is those who did not get the vaccination. In other words, those who got the placebo. And the blue line is those who did get the vaccination. So they had 3 cases in those, at least at this point, up to day 112 after the vaccination, in those who got vaccinated, but they had many more cases in those who didn't get vaccinated. So if you take the ratio of those, it's about a 95% efficacy in terms of preventing all those cases. So it is very effective. And we all know from our adult experience with the adults, you can get an infection after vaccination. So that's what those 3 at the bottom are. But usually it's very mild and upper respiratory and not deep-seated or causing hospitalizations or death. So the next slide. What about the serious side effects we talked about? So I put these data in regarding the myocarditis. So again, we don't know in children what the incidence is. We know from other countries like Israel, where this graph is, or this table is from, about the incidence because they have a longer experience with it. And it goes down to age 12 here, and it's split by males and females. And they tally the total doses and then the total number of cases of myocarditis, and then the rate per 100,000 after the first dose and after the second dose. So if you just, the main data I think is on the right side. After the second dose, what's the real risk? And this is, up to 30 days post-dose 2. And you can see that it's really a problem in males who are adolescents and young adults. So there were very few females that got myocarditis. And the males, since that's of interest here, are the ones who got it. So the adolescent males are the most at risk for myocarditis. The rate is, between 8 and 16 per 100,000. So it's very low rate. It is higher than the background, because some patients, it's not uncommon for virus infections in general to give myocarditis. So this is not an unexpected finding, the inflammation and so forth that can affect the heart. There is a baseline in a normal population that's certainly lower than these numbers. But as Tim Franson mentioned, the incidence of myocarditis with COVID itself is 6 times these numbers. So you reduce and prevent 6 times the number of myocarditis by getting the vaccine than you would by getting COVID. And you could argue, well, I'll just take my chances and not get COVID, but that's not happening. This virus finds you. Virtually everybody on the planet will get COVID. That's just a reality of this Delta variant. It spreads so much and our vaccination rates are so sluggish. So it finds you, especially the kids who are late to the game in terms of vaccination. So I think that was at my last slide, Amanda. Yeah. So those are the numbers, and we are happy to address the questions as Rachel may want to sift through them.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim and Tim. That was so helpful. I always learn so much when I get to listen to the two of you share your knowledge and expertise. We've got lots of really great questions, both that were submitted prior to today and some questions in the chat. And I think based on where we left off on myocarditis, we'll dig into one of those questions in the chat here. And it reads, is there an average time to manifestation of myocarditis in older populations after vaccination versus infection? And would you expect that sort of time frame to be the same in 5 to 11-year-olds? So I know that graphic that you had, the data from Israel, it was looking at, about 30 days after the second dose. Talk to me a little bit about, that data versus what we might see elsewhere or in other age groups.
Yeah, well, one good point that I didn't make is that usually the myocarditis is mild and transient. So it can affect the heart. You can get short of breath. The heart doesn't work quite as well, but it usually resolves then within days to weeks. So most patients, the vast majority of patients, it resolves. So that's the good news. And it does happen within that month period following the injections. And we think also, I think also following infection. So probably a similar kinds of time course. So those data probably capture most of the cases that happened.
Agreed.
Awesome. That's so helpful. I know that that's something that I've had lots of, people in the community reach out to me, or even my own friends and family wondering about that. So that's incredibly helpful to have that clarity. So this next question, I think, is probably the biggest question that I have heard from the community so far. And that is in regard to people with Duchenne being on relatively high dose of steroids and what that means for them, both with their baseline diagnosis of Duchenne and then that additional layer of steroids and immunosuppression. So can you talk a little bit about, for older patients who are at higher risk, also on long-term steroids, is the vaccine effective for them? So I guess, we're hearing concerns that the steroids would potentially neutralize the vaccine, or that they would need an additional dose, and then clarity around additional doses versus booster doses, because I know that that's incredibly confusing.
I'll let Tim take the last part of that, but I'll take the first part of that, and that is that the steroid, so I take care of patients that are immunocompromised. And we give them the vaccination. So steroids don't prevent the vaccine from working. We even vaccinate patients after bone marrow transplant or while they're on chemotherapy, much more immunosuppressive than doses than daily steroids. So you can mount an immune response. If you think about it, when you're on steroids, you're not being put in a bubble. It's not like you don't have an immune system. Now, yes, it may dampen a little bit, and I actually couldn't cite data of vaccines in Duchenne patients. Maybe you guys probably know better, but I don't think there's a significant lack of efficacy of other vaccines. So I think it is very safe and likely to be effective, And certainly, the one thing we can say for certain, COVID infection is worse than vaccine. And I'm sure that's the case in Duchenne boys as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. And I would add to that, there are a couple of reports that raise questions about immune response when somebody gets vaccination at the same time they have a boost in steroids. So that's an unknown. And perhaps it is worth future study, but it appears that in various populations, if one is on a stable dose of steroids, there's no reason to anticipate issues with vaccine response. And then the other question is with booster doses. And one would anticipate that much like influenza and other things which are seasonable and where vaccine-associated immunity begins to wane over time, we'll need that in adults and children.
Yeah, did you want to talk about the extra doses? Besides boost, there's that difference between booster and additional doses.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks.
And that's particularly confusing.
That it is, and I don't know that we have any settled recommendations as yet. I'd be interested if you're doing anything in the transplant groups at Nationwide Children's. I've seen no promulgation of recommendations for that.
Yeah, we haven't been doing. The difference would be if you test for antibodies and you don't have them, or they're very low, and you're given an additional dose of the vaccine. In a way, it's the same. You're trying to boost immunity, so you could call it booster, but officially the name booster dose is that other dose way later to really get the immunity, make sure it's still strong later on in time, and that it's not waning. So a booster is really something you take because you've been waning, whereas an additional dose is something you're given because it didn't work that great. But we haven't been routinely monitoring those people that are on immunosuppressions to make sure that it worked, but it's a great idea.
And I will say, we actually had the opportunity to liaise directly with the CDC to clarify that piece as it pertains to Duchenne and immunosuppression. And obviously they can't give us, in Duchenne, you should do X, Y, Z, because they're really thinking about, population-based health. But when you look at those special populations that they suggest should receive an additional dose, people who are immunocompromised are included on that list. So it is something that I think, for those of you listening in today, I would encourage you to talk to your neuromuscular doctor or one of your other care team members to figure out what makes the most sense for your family and for your child, and how to offer, the most protection and stay as safe as possible.
There's also a question about weekend steroids, and that shouldn't make any difference either. It should be just as safe.
Yep, absolutely. We think about weekend steroids typically being less immunosuppressive than daily, but I think, there's also a lot that we still don't know just about steroids in general too, which is certainly tricky. Okay, so here's a great question. We are also at the top of flu season. I know that we're starting to see a fair amount of flu in my own community. Can somebody receive the flu shot and the COVID shot at the same time?
Yes, that's very acceptable and preferred. Go for them both while you're there.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe different arms. I did mine that way.
I know that was the conversation that the pharmacist and I had for me as well. And it's nice that you can double up, one less trip to the pharmacy. So Tim Cripe, I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't think that there's a super straightforward answer about it, but I know that you're very much a clinical trialist. So can you talk about potential implications of COVID vaccination and clinical trial enrollment and recruitment? Do we think that it could potentially hinder or perhaps enable recruitment? Any thoughts, anything that you're starting to see in the community?
Are you talking about recruitment to other kinds of studies like gene therapy studies, et cetera?
Yes. Yes. So if my 6-year-old with Duchenne is vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine, would that potentially affect his ability to enroll in a clinical trial, either gene therapy or otherwise?
Yeah, the only restriction is usually 2 weeks or a small, short time frame where they don't want to have had you vaccinated, because if there's some effect or some event or some side effect, then it confuses it. Is it due to the new clinical trial? Is it due to the vaccine? But having had it longer ago than usually 2 weeks, and it would be written specifically in that trial, would not be a problem.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so this next one is in regard to patients who have either died of COVID or died of vaccine injuries. And I think maybe we could just take a step back and talk a little bit about safety around vaccines and how vaccine injuries are reported, maybe even talking a little bit about that VAERS system. Maybe Tim Franson, you could tell us a little bit about what that is.
Well, in point of fact, the surveillance for adverse events, serious or non-serious, are very strictly monitored, and primarily because most of the folks who got the COVID vaccines early have been on observation for incredibly extensive periods, years now, for a number of them. The requirements really are for healthcare professionals are to report any adverse events to the Food and Drug Administration, and the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS, is something that practitioners respect, and it serves as a very important input valve for looking at trends of issues. So that's the process. What we've seen is very low rates. I won't say surprisingly, because I don't know that folks anticipated extremely high rates of anything other than short-term local reactions. But certainly when you contrast what have been reported as possible vaccine associated severe events or mortality, when you compare that to what happens with COVID in the unvaccinated, as Tim Cripe already pointed out, it's multi-fold difference in terms of the overall risks. I don't have at my disposal exact figures, but I found all the recent reviews to be incredibly reassuring about the safety, both short and long term, of vaccine.
Great. And I think a related question, but sort of a different angle on a similar topic, is how do we reconcile the US's recent approval of the vaccine for kids while we're seeing in Norway and Sweden stopping vaccination due to a rise in cases of myocarditis? This seems to contradict the comment that COVID caused myocarditis more than the vaccine.
Yeah, there's a lot of variable reporting, and I find it difficult to sort that out. You probably have seen that the review of the Moderna vaccine in graduating from emergency use authorization to full approval has been delayed so that FDA and others can look at the frequency of myocarditis in especially in recent European reports. I think until we see the figures, we are having difficulty making any definitive call, but I continue to be reassured by the rigorous data that we have seen here. So my advice is to continue with the CDC and FDA recommendations here. And as we see more information from Europe, that would be great. I don't know what kind of intercurrent other viral infections are circulating there. We do know other viruses cause myocarditis. We do know that those kind of things cycle in different geographic areas. So again, without rambling on further, I think those require more clarification, but should not dissuade folks from looking at this six-fold difference in risk.
Absolutely. And that actually, it brings up a question of my own for Tim Cripe. I know that you have a background in genetics, and I would be curious if you have any thoughts about differences from population to population based on background, genetic variation in, a Scandinavian population versus, a Southeast Asian population. Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's a really good question. I don't think it's been studied well enough. We do know that there are differences in immunity between people that have different, what we call HLA types. So the tissue compatibility molecules on a cell or a tissue or an organ that determine whether it gets rejected if you transplant a kidney, for example. Those HLA types also are very important in determining immunity because it determines how the different foreign antigens, the viral proteins, are presented to the immune system and how effectively they're seen by the immune system. And so some HLA types that can run in families or can be more common in certain populations can put people at more risk than others for autoimmunity, for example, rheumatoid arthritis associated with certain HLA types, or with immune response. And there are some people that don't respond. Their immune system is perfectly good. They're adults. They don't get infected, and that they don't react to a measles vaccine, but they react to all the other vaccines. Like there's a hole in their immunity, and we don't totally understand why that is, but it may have something to do with these genetic variants.
So it's probably not something I could go to my PCP and say, will you test me for my HLA type because I want to understand, my lack of response or something like that to a COVID or any other vaccine.
Right, just that not enough is known.
Okay, perfect. This is a little bit related to that. So I've been told that immunity comes from white blood cells to bone marrow and that no antibodies doesn't necessarily mean no immunity. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's right. So there's two major branches of the immune system, what's called the humoral and the cellular. The humoral is the antibodies. Those come from B cells. All of your blood cells come from the bone marrow. But when the cells that sense the virus or the vaccine, so-called dendritic cells, when they see that foreign protein from the virus or the vaccine, they instruct both sides of the immune system essentially to start their thing. So they instruct the B cells to make antibodies, and they instruct the T cells, which are other kinds of lymphocytes, to grow and react against that protein. And so you can have a situation where you didn't really instruct the antibodies to be made, but you instructed the T cells to be made. These are white blood cells. They do come from the bone marrow. And the difference is in what they do. The antibodies will coat the virus and alert the immune system to clear it, whereas the T cells actually attack infected cells. So if the virus infects a lung epithelial cell, for example, it's not going to be antibodies that attack that. It's going to be the T cells that recognize it and destroy it and stop the virus from spreading. So you can certainly have cellular immunity without the humoral immunity. So that's true that if, just because you don't have antibodies, but they tend to go together, and the antibodies are easy to measure and the T cells are hard to measure. So they tend to go together, and so we usually test the antibodies.
Tim, would you add anything to that with your ID background?
No, I think that's very well put. And those two branches of the immune system have slightly different but complementary responsibilities. So we should be reassured they're working inside us to our benefit.
I will add, if you got the humoral immunity, but it faded, and so now you've lost your antibody, you probably still have your cellular immunity and are at less risk for complications from an infection.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so that makes me think about boosters and that waning immunity over time. So in a population where we've got adult parents of kids with Duchenne who are, at high risk, but the parents are at average risk, they might not necessarily qualify for a booster dose. Do you think that that's something that they should push for or advocate for? The question reads, technically I'm not eligible, but I worry about transmission to my kids.
Well, the best thing would be for the child to get the vaccine now that it's approved, unless they're under 5. So that would be number one. Number two, Yeah, hopefully boosters will be approved for everybody eventually. We've seen people get COVID infections, as I mentioned, after being vaccinated. Again, the vaccine prevents the real sick, but certainly an upper respiratory, or cold, and feeling, under the weather can happen even after vaccination. And parenthetically, I'll float a theory by you, and Tim Franson can weigh in. I know we're about to run out of time, but the kind of immunity that works in your nose and in your upper airway system, that's the mucosal area, is usually IgA mediated. These are the secreted antibodies, whereas the IgG is in your bloodstream. And we know that IgA is more transient, it fades more. So I think what's happening is you've got good immunity inside with the IgG, but the IgA is faded. And so you're susceptible to another upper airway infection. And a booster will then boost that IgA back up and make you safer, but it's going to fade again, likely, even after a booster.
Yeah, Tim, I think that's a very reasonable description of how these kinds of protection cycle, and it makes boosters seem much more helpful in these situations. But what we have to worry about in addition, it's not just our family members, but exposure to those around us who are unvaccinated, which probably comprises a much greater threat to our children and grandchildren. So encouraging broader vaccine compliance would be the ideal protector.
Agreed.
Great, thank you so much. I know that we've got 3 minutes left, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So in that scenario, if a child is not 5 years old, they fall into that bucket of, birth to 4, like my own little one. Any insight on timeline for these itty bitties who are not yet eligible for protection?
I have not seen any data on ongoing studies at this point, and it's unclear what their level of susceptibility to COVID is. So it's a huge unknown in my mind.
I think studies are happening in the younger population, but we don't know the results, and they're behind the other ages.
Excellent. And then sort of related, not really, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm still going to just say it out loud because I think it bears clarification. Can we assume that there will be a full approval for pediatric populations prior to that emergency status being lifted to just ensure continued access, even when we're not necessarily in the state of a pandemic, or what does that look like?
I think that's a pretty easy one. I can't imagine of a health policy system that would declare the emergency over and leave our children uncovered. So that's not going to happen.
I think that little bit of reassurance is always helpful. Being a parent can be anxiety inducing, certainly. And then, okay, so I have one last question, and I know that we talked a little bit about it, but I know that I am still confused, particularly when I look at the CDC websites and all of the things. So should we be doing antibody testing for kids after that second dose to see if they're producing antibodies or need an additional dose?
I mean, the data from this study show that almost everybody, if not everybody in the trial, had good antibody levels. So it really isn't needed to test it.
Awesome.
Yeah, I would agree.
And then, go right ahead.
I guess as we kind of talked about, you could argue maybe in an immunosuppressed population, which is relevant to the steroids, it might be something to do. I know at the little clinic in Kroger or at any of the pharmacies, you can get $25 an antibody test. So if you need reassurance.
Perfect. All right. Well, we are at the top of the hour. I think we were able to get through most of the questions. I know that there were a lot of them, and so we tried to get through as many as we possibly could. This is so incredibly helpful. Tim Franson, Tim Cripe, you both are just wonderful and wise and insightful. And I know that I always learn so much from the two of you, and I am quite confident that everybody else listening in has learned from the two of you today as well. For everybody listening in, we will go ahead and update our COVID-19 resource page on our website with this additional information. Please keep an eye out for those updated resources. Feel free to submit any additional questions to us and we can dig into those. And thanks for joining us. Everybody have a happy Friday, and thanks so much for joining us. We'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar.
Stay healthy.